or F and D.
All right, folks, we're going to get started. Depending on how many questions you all have, we either have a lot or more than a lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and get cracking on this practice exam. All right, so a few notes. Probably the most important note for Monday. I have already mentioned this, but I want to reiterate. Dr. Caden and her BSAD 153 class will need this for their end of 8-week semester quiz. So we will be in BH 1420. You show up in here, you will be taking an exam, but it will be a different type of exam. You won't get a good grade for it because I won't be able to apply that for this course. So please make sure you go to that room. As far as the exam criteria, I strongly recommend that you show up several minutes early. If possible, show up at least 5 minutes early. I try to start the exams early where I can to give people extra time. Please bring a writing implement. I recommend that you bring a pencil and eraser. You can do it in pen, but if you have to correct an error, it's a lot harder to do that when you do it in pen. So pencil and eraser is my preferred mode of writing. You will not need a calculator. There are no calculations on the exam. As far as the breakdown of questions on the exam, there are 20 multiple choice questions. 14 of those will come directly from the chapters that we've covered, 2 questions from each chapter. There will be 4 questions on the Excel activities we've done in class, which will be very similar to the ones that were in the practice exam. And then 2 NetSuite questions. The NetSuite questions are not going to be highly technically detailed. As long as you've done the NetSuite assignments and recall some of the things we've talked about, they should be pretty straightforward. And then, so that's kind of the breakdown of what we're going to be talking about. Again, I'm going to go through this. I'm not going to cover every single point. As you see, the study guide is kind of long. It's 5 pages with single space and a lot of lines. I will cover the things that I think are the most important for you to focus on. Just as a note, that does not mean that those are the only thing you should study. If it's in the study guide, it is live for the exam, okay? The ones that I cover are going to be more likely, but that just doesn't mean that I won't ask questions on everything. And if you have questions about a particular item or not clear, I strongly encourage you to reach out to me now and let me know so you can get some clarification. All right, so starting with chapter 1, one of the things in chapter 1 talks about what are the 2 key components of the definition of an information system. That was one of the very first things we talked about. So we have to have things that come in and things that go out. So input and output, those are 2 key components, which is one of the things I like to talk about. 3 categories of information that categories of information should an AIS be able to capture. That's actually in the slide. So I want to go back to that slide and look at that. So a system that records, processes, and reports on transactions to provide financial and non-financial information. By the way, the reason I stopped on transactions is that's the keyword that you should focus on. Use accounting information to aid in decision-making, so transactions making, and incorporates appropriate levels of internal controls for transactions. So transactions, decision-making, internal controls, those are kind of the anchor points for that particular item. All right, going back to the study guide. The firm value chain, what are the primary activities in there? Be able to identify and define each activities and the secondary activities. I will not give you a list the items question. You will not need to replicate the items in the firm value chain, but I strongly recommend that you have a fairly good working knowledge of the items, both in the primary and secondary activities, and be able to define them if I give you a question about them. Most of them are fairly intuitive, okay? They're not particularly difficult, but I do want you to have passing familiarity, but it will not be list all 9 items and define them. That's not the question I will ask on the exam. Move to chapter 2. Chapter 2, 2 major types of business process models. This is one of our focuses in this course. We talked about BPMN diagrams and UML diagrams. BPMN diagrams are activity models, and UML diagrams are structure models. Remember, activity models kind of dictate how a person would view the system, and the structure models dictate how a system uses the system, basically, how a computer uses the system. Moving on, what are the primary purposes of AIS documentation? This is kind of the focus of the chapter. It talks about documentation. So there were 4 slides on this, and I underlined some very important words that you need to note. Specific purpose of documentation: promoting organizational efficiency, promoting organizational effectiveness, proper design and operation of internal controls. That's an internal controls thing again. I think that important for some reason. And then compliance with relevant laws and regulations. Make sure you're aware of it. Going back to the study guide. What are the steps in the data processing cycle in the flow chart? So what are the four primary steps plus an additional step? So this is probably the only type question I would ask over flow charts because we cover them at a pretty superficial level. But remember, flow charts can be diagrammed according to four different process identities, and that was going to be IPSO, information or input, processing, storage, and output. So I talked about it IPSO, input, processing, storage, and output. But there's also connections that occur between those activities, and those were called flows, so message flows. And those are somewhat consistent with what we talk about in BPMN diagrams, but they're detailed a little bit different in flowcharts. So that's probably all you really need to remember for flowcharts. That being said, all I'm going to say with respect to this section right here, okay, this section right here, very, very important. This should be the majority of the time focused in chapter 2 studying, which starts with, it says business process implementation diagrams, and all the information that follows that. You should know that extremely well, okay? Because that was something that you'll have to replicate for chapters 5, 6, and 7. So if you're not familiar with BPMN diagrams, now's the crunch time. That's where you need to pick it up. Remember that in replication on the exam, all I will ask you is to replicate a simple BPMN model, which is basically a one department model. That being said, you will need to know how to interpret both multi-department models and multi-entity models, okay? So you'll need to actually understand how to interpret messages across lanes, which are departments, and then messages across pools, which are entities. So make sure you're moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about UML diagrams. One of the first questions is, what are classes? And classes, just at a very basic level, are items that the organization wants information about, okay? We have 4 general categories of classes. 3 of them are primary: resources, events, and agents, REA. And then we have that 4th one, which is a little bit weird. It's kind of an additional piece of information that doesn't fall into cleanly in one of those other categories. That's a conceptual structure. Again, for UML diagrams, if I ask you to do a UML diagram to replicate it, you will be responsible for the first 3 classes in diagramming. I won't ask you to diagram a conceptual structure, but I will ask you to interpret conceptual structures, okay? So you'll need to understand what they represent. All right, very, very important. I think this is reiterated all throughout the study guide. You will need to be able to interpret multiplicities in UML diagrams and process areas through chapters 5, 6, and 7. So if I put a multiplicity up, you'll need to interpret what that is. Also, I may put up situations where there's a multiplicity that's question marks. You have to tell me what the multiplicities are and what they represent. There is some room for interpretation on these. I believe there's a practice exam question that actually follows that path. And so if you answered something that's different than my answer, I would give you credit if your interpretation is sensible, okay? I think in this particular example, it's very hard to make an argument that's not the one that I give in the practice exam, but if you have an interpretation that's sensible, then you can get credit for that. As far as rest of chapter 3, rules of decision-making, there were basically 3 types of business rules, and we talked about those to some degree. I would make sure that you're familiar with those types of business rules. Also remember, the business rules are what create internal controls. They are not internal controls on their own. So this is basically what specifies a need for internal controls. The types of business rules: obligatory, prohibited, and allowed. Make sure you know those and also understand what they represent. So obligatory says this was what should or must happen. Prohibited is saying this is what should or must not happen. And then allowed is saying this is something that can happen. Moving on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 was kind of an afterthought because it was just a representation of stuff we'd already talked about, but that was relational databases. Some of the things that are really important with respect to relational databases is this question right here. How are relations, entities, and attributes depicted in a relational database? That basically, that answer aligns with tables, rows, and columns. A relation is a table, an entity is a row, and a column. A column is an attribute. Now, I do want to clarify that because that's a little bit confusing, because entities as rows does not make intuitive sense. I want to make sure that when we talk about that, we're saying all instances of a particular entity are represented by rows. Okay, so that's how we depict that. So tables, rows, columns. There's also, I think this may come up, but there's also another term for records or rows. Those are called tuples. So if you see the word tuple, that's just another term for a record or a row. What are the basic requirements of tables? So we talked about several rules. I would make sure you're familiar with all of those rules. Most important are going to be the entity integrity rule and the referential integrity rule. Refer to primary key and foreign key requirements. So entity integrity rule says that let's just actually bring it up. I've got slides here. Just quote it and then have somebody say, but you didn't tell us exactly what it was. So entity integrity rule, primary keys must have data values. They cannot be null. Okay. Referential integrity rule says foreign keys must be null or match one of the data values that exist in the corresponding table. Remember, foreign keys are primary keys from other tables. And it's possible that you can have null values in there if it doesn't exist in that table. So that's why they must be null or match a data value that already exists. Also, please remember, there are other rules that you should be aware of here. Make sure you're familiar with those rules. I will not ask you to replicate them, but they may be relevant to decision making, particularly when we talk about attributes of a record can only have a single value. Remember, that was one of the big reasons why certain values cannot be represented as foreign keys in other tables, because they have multiplicities of greater than one. So if they have a single value, if they have more than a single value, we can't use them as foreign keys. That was one of those rules that we saw multiple times throughout the semester. Again, I won't ask you to replicate this rule, but I may ask you to interpret this rule with respect to why we can't use certain fields as foreign keys, even if they're a primary key in a table. Okay. All right. Moving on to chapter 5. So what are the typical transactions and journal entries in a business-to-business revenue cycle? I'm going to say this for both revenues and purchasing. You 100% need to know the transactions, okay? There were not that many transactions in each of these cycles. They were very limited. As far as the conversion cycle, I would be familiar with the transactions, but it's not likely that I'm going to ask you how to record actual overhead transactions, okay? I will be less likely to ask you detailed questions about transactions for the conversion process, but I will absolutely ask you questions about the transactions related to revenue and purchasing, okay? So you do need to be familiar with those, because you have taken your accounting courses, so you should be familiar with them because they relate to what we talk about in the diagram. All right. So you will need to be able to prepare a basic VPMN diagram of the revenue process. Basic meaning that we're going to talk about a single departmental or a single lane depiction, which doesn't mean that it occurs across a single department, but we're not going to worry about depicting different department flows. So you just need to do a very simple. That's kind of the first example of each of these that we looked at. That's what you're going to be responsible for. Also, please make a note of this, is that you do need to know transaction recognition points that relate to the diagram. So for example, if I ask you at what point in the revenue process do we recognize revenue? You need to know which of those activities that you put in the diagram is the point that we recognize revenue. And just for context, that's when we ship the goods to the customer. So, all right. UML diagrams. Be able to prepare a UML diagram of the revenue process includes all primary resources, events, and agents. Okay. I can't emphasize this enough. This is going to be true for all the other ones. This is the area that in the past year, my students have struggled with the most. If I look at scores that have points that taken off, I can tell you right now, most of the time it's going to be because of UML diagrams. Spend plenty of time looking at UML diagrams and be familiar with them. At the very base level, make sure you understand the basic framework diagrams that I provided with you. So those are going to be the REA diagrams, previous to conceptual structures. So I gave you kind of a template for each one of the revenue or each one of the processes for revenue, for purchasing, and for conversion. Make sure you know what all the resources, the events, and agents. Make sure you understand the associations. I would be able to interpret the multiplicities, but I probably will not ask you to replicate multiplicities within a diagram because that's a lot of information. I will absolutely ask you what goes into the diagram and what the associations are, though. And I would say spend plenty of time focused on that. I can't emphasize that enough. If you say you're going to spend 5 hours studying for this exam, probably 2 of those should be spent just on UML diagrams, okay? This is likely the area that people are going to struggle the most, so I'm giving you a heads up, is that in my history, this is the one part that people struggle with the most. I anticipate it will still be the part that people struggle with the most on this exam, but I would like it to be less so than in the past, okay? Interpret multiplicities in the UML diagram of the revenue process. Like I said before, for all of these process areas, you will need to understand what the UML diagrams represent or what the multiplicities represent, be able to interpret those. Also, if I give you blanks, then you'll have to actually be able to give me the multiplicities and provide an interpretation. Again, there is room for interpretation. It's a limited amount of room for interpretation. Like if the answer is 0 to 1 and you give me many to many, I'm probably going to count that wrong, okay? but you can give me interpretation, and if your interpretation is sensible, I will give you credit for that. We will come back to that because we're going to talk about this 2 more times. Internal controls. What are some general examples of internal controls? So remember, we've talked about those with all 3 process areas, so be familiar with those. Certainly be able to understand and interpret the difference between access and application controls. That's one of the most important things. Those relate to IT controls because IT controls is a big focus of this course. So make sure you understand the difference between general/access controls and application controls. That's one of the primary things. Also, this is not as relevant to IAIS specific, but it's one of my favorite things to talk about. Make sure you know what segregation of duties are, okay? So segregation of duties, 3 letters, C-A-R, custody of assets, authorization of transactions, recording of transactions. Those dictate 3 responsibility areas that should never be in the hands of the same individual, okay? All 3 of those should be separated out. Yes. Yeah, custody of assets, authorization of transactions, recording of transactions. Those responsibilities should always be separated out within a process area. And you know that I'm big on custody or on segregation of duties, so you should expect questions on that. So make sure you're familiar with it. I'm telling you right now, 100% chance I will ask questions on it. Okay, so make sure you're familiar with it. Yes. So custody of assets, authorization of transactions, recording of transactions. As you're studying, look for some examples that we've talked about, of course, over the course of the semester so far. There were actually multiple times we talked specifically about segregation of duties. You should be able to identify when a segregation of duties control exists, okay? So those are going to be the 2 primary focus areas for controls. Understanding the difference between access and application controls and understanding segregation of duties. One of those is AIS specific. One of those is because Dr. Barnes just likes talking about it. All right. I guess since we're talking about it, because it actually says what 2 different categories AIS controls: access and application. What word actually should you be looking for with respect to access controls? Employee, okay, dictates what the employee is allowed to do within a system. And then what word should you look for application? Yeah, what the system does or what it should be doing to track activity. Okay. All right. Going on here, there's going to be a lot of repetition. Again, for purchasing process, you do need to understand how to record transactions in a purchasing cycle. All right, so make sure you're familiar with that. You need to be able to create a basic BPMN diagram, 1 lane. Okay. You do need to be able to recognize recognize transactions at certain points. So the transaction recognition points. This one's going to be about the recognition of accounts payable or when the cash disbursement occurs. UML diagram probably doesn't go without saying that UML diagrams are important. Make sure you know at least at a basic level, the full REA diagram for the UML for purchasing. And then, make sure you look at some of the basic AIS control considerations of the purchasing process. That was at the end that we kind of mildly talked about. Again, the dimensions of that are just the same. Focus on access versus application controls and make sure you understand how segregation of duties is relevant to this process area. All right. Chapter 7, that was our last chapter. This is the conversion process, typical transactions in a manufacturing conversion cycle. As I said before, this one is less critical. There are some transactions that you should probably know. All of the work in process inventory transactions I would be familiar with, okay? As well as the transaction to move out of work in process into finished goods. So if it basically has work in process somewhere in the transaction, I would make sure you understand what that transaction represents. Moving stuff into work in process, moving stuff out of work in process. If it's an actual overhead transaction, be familiar with it just because that's something you've studied before, but I'm not likely to ask you a question about it, especially because there's not transaction recognition that goes along with it. Okay. Part of the reason for this is because you do need to be able to prepare a basic BPN diagram of the conversion process. If you don't know what the journal entries look like, you can't tell me transaction recognition points in the conversion diagram. So you probably need to be familiar with that. That's the only reason I'm telling you, make sure you're familiar with the journal entries for this process area. The UML diagram, heads up on the UML diagram. This tends to be the one that people overlook. They feel like that they know the revenue purchasing diagrams. There's an equal chance I will ask you any one of the 3. Okay. So if I ask you a question about a conversion process diagram, then you should probably be prepared to answer that conversion process diagram. So do all 3, don't just do 2 and call it good. Okay. This one is the most confusing out of all of them because it doesn't kind of fit the same pattern as all of them, which means that you probably should focus on it more than the other 2. Interpret multiplicities, and then one thing that I've talked about already, this is kind of the last bullet point that we haven't talked about here. Or actually, let's talk about this. A basic AIS control converts consideration conversion process, same dimensions as before, access and application controls, and segregation entities. There were tables for all three chapters at the end. Those tables are listed at the end of the slides. Make sure you look at those tables, not just the stuff that's on the slide, but the stuff that's in the book, because it was like a slide rule that you could slide through the entire through the electronic textbook. I think it's longer and bigger in the actual textbook, but make sure you're familiar with those. Let's talk about this point right here. Interpret a UML diagram of the revenue purchasing conversion processes. I have said it before, I will say it again. You do not need to create an integrated UML diagram. That will not be a requirement. If you do it, fine. You only have 50 minutes, so that's going to take some effort to do that. I will not ask you to create an integrated UML diagram. I will 100% ask you to interpret an integrated UML diagram. So there were a lot of things that we talked about with respect to that. The most important is you need to be able to identify what activities are unique to a given process area, what activities are shared between a given process area. I shouldn't say activities, I should say classes. What classes are unique to a given process area, what classes are shared between process areas. If they are shared, make sure you can identify which processes share these classes, okay? So that was something we focused on and talked a lot about. Make sure you're familiar with all of that. It probably goes without saying that if you know all three of the UML diagrams, if you know revenue, purchasing, conversion, creating this diagram shouldn't actually be that difficult. I won't do that for time's sake, but you should have a pretty good understanding of how the UML diagram looks, okay? That does it for the chapter stuff. Let's talk about Excel. The one thing I'm going to tell you about the Excel stuff, if it's an Excel formula that we used in class, you're responsible for knowing the contents of that formula. I realize that that gets claimed as unfair. It's like, well, Dr. Barnes, if I use it in Excel, it will tell me the prompts. And I said, yes, yeah, I realize that. But to be able to get a mastery of it, you need to have at least an innate knowledge of what those prompts represent, okay? So for example, some examples that I would talk about. So if I said, I want you to actually be able to tell me what the elements of a RAND between function are. You should know RAND between specifies what the range is, okay? I have to tell you what is the beginning of my range and the end of my range, all right? So that's an example, an easy example for that. If I ask you what are the time value of money formulas, okay? Present value. You should know what the elements of the time value of money are. And by the way, I know that this is going to be really, really frustrating because you're going to say, well, there's multiple elements in each of these. They're fairly common to each of them, okay? So for time value of money, any of the time value of money equations, they're going to have a rate. They're going to have a number of periods. And then for present value, it's going to specify payments, future value, and then the annuity types if there's an annuity. For future value, it will specify present value instead of future value. And then for payments, it will specify present value and future value. So there are three formulas that we talked about that were pretty high level on those. Those were going to be the present value, future value, and payment formulas. They basically all contain the same information. It's just whichever formula you're using is not included in that information in the formula itself. IR and net present value, have some familiarity with those. Those are much simpler formulas though, because those just specify ranges. But at a very basic level, if it's listed on here and it's a formula we used, you should know the elements of those formulas, be familiar with those, okay? I'm not trying to trick you on any of these formulas, but if I ask you a question and I do, it's something I expect you to be able to interpret, even if you're not sitting in front of Excel, okay? And then NetSuite assignments, as I said before, as long as you took fairly diligent notes on those and worked through the activities, it shouldn't be that difficult. The questions that I ask are things that we did that were fairly routine with the NetSuite platform. We've only done 3 NetSuite assignments, and all of those were less than a class period, so you have a limited amount of information you have to parse through. Plus, there's only 2 questions on that, so you shouldn't panic too much as far as that goes. All right, that does it with the study guide. Are there any questions, any items that I didn't cover that you need some clarification on? Yes.
Will we need to like write out the formula, or will we just be given a formula and need to interpret the parts of it?
You'll just need to interpret it. So like the Excel is only going to be a multiple choice questions. So like I might ask you, here's the Excel formula. What should go into this part? Like I might put a question mark and say, what would you input into the formula here? Or I might say, here's the Excel formula. What does this component represent in the formula? Something along those lines. Good question. Not to say that not all questions are great. That was just a particularly good question. I was just pointing. All right. let's talk through the practice exam then. So the practice exam key is available on Brightspace now. So if you missed something and can't go or a little bit confused about it, or if you're reviewing later, you can refer to that. All right. Part one, which of the following is not a primary activity in the value chain? Okay, which of the following is not a primary activity in the value chain? Remember, the value chain starts out with inbound logistics, okay? Then it talks about outbound logistics after we generate the sale. And associated with that, one of the primary activities is marketing, because we can't generate sales if we don't have marketing activities. So inbound logistics, outbound logistics, marketing, all primary activities. What's the support activity? Information technology, okay? That does not directly affect the customer. So the supporting activity. The income statement account most likely affected by an AIS investment in customer relationship management would be, these types of questions tend to really intimidate people. So this question is not that difficult if you think about what are the primary accounts affected by customers, okay? What do customers generally generate in an organization? They generate sales or revenues, okay? So even though this looks like a really daunting question, it's like, I don't know. It's like, yes, you do. Okay. You know, customers generate revenues. So it's going to be revenues. That's all this question is asking. It's a very fancy way of asking a very simple question. Okay. Will I do that very frequently? Probably not, but I will do it. Okay. What accounts used to explain and illustrate how business process systems operate? Okay. This one's pretty straightforward because this was the focus of our second chapter, which, by the way, you may notice that I'm going in sequence of the chapters here. So what was the focus of the second chapter? That was documentation, because we had two forms of documentation that we dealt with. That was the goal of documentation, is to actually be able to illustrate business processes. Which of the following best describes a BPMN message flow? Okay, so I guess I should scroll down. Okay. So the sequence of activities in a process? No, that's just basically a flow. That's an activity flow. Okay. I'm going to go to C, affect the flow of the business process. No, because that's still an activity flow. Show the branching and merging in a business process. That would still be an activity flow. We're talking about message flow. We're talking about different entities or different departments. Okay. Those are those arrows that move vertically as opposed to horizontally. Those would represent message flows because we're actually communicating information between departments or entities. So B is our answer. Which of the following is best description of associations? This sounds like a UML diagram question. So association, that's basically a line between classes, okay? So what do those lines between classes mean? Well, it's not a group of classes, it's not a group of items. It is a relationship between two classes. Anytime you see a line between two boxes, that's basically saying this class has an association or a relationship with this class. This is used to depict that association. And then those numbers that are the multiplicities depict how that association exists, like what that association, what the modification of that association is. Consider the customer class table. All right, so we got the customer class table listed up here. And it says, which of the attributes would make the best primary key? So what do we know about a primary key, okay? What's the primary attribute of a primary key? It has to be a unique identifier of the class, okay? It has to be a unique identifier of the class. So we're looking for a customer class. What would be the best unique identifier? Would customer name be a good unique identifier? Probably not. Probably not city, street, state, probably not postal code. What about customer ID? I like that one, okay? We can assign a unique customer ID for each of our customers. So that's going to be our best primary. Which of the following correctly describes the entity integrity rule? We just looked at that. The entity integrity rule doesn't specify the unique identification characteristics of primary key, but basically says the primary key cannot be null. We cannot have a null value, okay? Each primary key of the table, our primary key must have data values that cannot be null. That's A. Question number 8. The main purpose of using foreign keys in a relational data model. So what's the goal of a foreign key? So in order to understand that, we need to understand what a foreign key is. Remember, a foreign key is a primary key from another table that is used in a separate table to link those tables together. So if I have one table, say if I've got a inventory ID table, and then I've got like kind of a inventory category table, and then I want to link, okay, what category does inventory fall in? I can use that inventory ID, which is our primary ID in one table, into the inventory category table and say, this falls within this category, okay? Now, keep in mind, one of the things that we identified, which may kind of dispute my statement that I just made there, is foreign keys have very specific characteristics. First of all, they have to be a primary key. They can be null because we can't identify foreign keys that do not exist in the original table. but they're used to link data, and they can only do so if they have a one-to-one relationship. At least that's all the examples we looked at. There's an argument to say they could have a 0-to-1 relationship, which that would make sense if they're null, but a 0-to-1 or 1-to-1 relationship. If they have a multiplicity that has a star at the very end, we cannot use it as a foreign key. That was one of the things that we focused on in this particular course. Which of the following counts is generally not impacted as part of the revenue process? All right. This should be a pretty simple question. A lot of people get confused as to what I'm asking. So revenue process, what does that to deal with? Well, generation of revenues. What are the things that get involved in generation of revenues? Recorded accounts receivable. We generate sales. We collect cash. What does not get generated as part of revenue? Accounts payable. Accounts payable is part of the purchasing process. Okay. Which of the following best describes the difference between access controls and application controls? Okay, remember, we're looking for the depiction of what the employee does versus what the system does. I don't actually use those terms, but I kind of allude to them. Access controls limit who can change records, the employees. Application controls ensure the data integrity and provide an audit trail of any changes. That's what the system does, okay? So even though I don't use those specific words, it was alluded to in answer A. Which of the following is the most likely order of a basic purchases activities model? Okay, so let's go ahead and go through these one by one. I may skip one. All right, analyze inventory, place purchase order, send payment. Okay, do we probably need to receive the goods before we send payment? Probably so. So we're missing a step, so A is not our answer. Request price availability, receive items, record accounts payable. We missing something there? Yeah, I'm missing kind of the payments. Yeah, the payments. Okay. Request price and availability, place purchase order, receive items, send payment. What do you guys think about C? I like C, but let's look at D just in case. Create purchase order, create journal entry, receive items, send payment. Do we create the journal entry before we receive the items? No, those need to be transposed. Okay, we receive the items, then create the journal entry. So C is the only one that's intuitively sensible. Which of the following would most likely be a foreign key in the purchases table? So again, foreign key is a primary key in a separate table used to link the purchases table to that table. So it's not going to be something that occurs natively in the purchases table. It's going to be a describer from another table. So purchase order date, purchase order number, product description, those all sound like something that, well, actually the first two, those would be purchase table. Product description could be a key that was included in the purchase table, but it's probably not. Because remember, in order to be a foreign key, it has to be a unique identifier. All right, product description is probably not a unique identifier, so we're probably not going to use that, which means supplier number is probably the one that's the most likely to be a foreign key. Which of the types of businesses is least likely to employ conversion process? What does conversion process represent? What type of business? Manufacturing, okay? Because remember, we talked about different types of business processes. We talked about service lines. We talked about merchandising, manufacturing. Conversion is primarily manufacturing. So is restaurant manufacturing? Yeah, they're manufacturing delicious cheeseburgers. I had one last night, which is why I'm in such a good mood. Okay. Bakery, they're a restaurant. So yeah, in fact, restaurant. Automotive factory, that's manufacturing. What about a retail store? Retail store is merchandising, so they're not going to have conversion, at least not to the degree that we would expect. Okay. Consider the following BPM and diagram as the conversion sub-process. By the way, I don't particularly like this question. I probably should have changed this question in this practice exam. So if you struggle with this question, don't feel bad. It's unlikely to ask a question like this one, at least not this nuanced, this type of question here. So which of the following steps are correct and error in the above diagram? So it says change the intermediate event to a start event. So it's saying we should move this and start this, which makes no sense because you're not going to have discard errors until actually after inspection of the work. Change the intermediate event to an exclusive gateway. Now, basically what this is saying is that could we answer a yes, no question? And technically, yes, we could. We could say, is the work good? Yes or no? And then you can create a gateway, which is why I don't like this question. So this one is a possible answer, but it's not our best answer. Add a equal flow to the end event after the discard errors activity. So it's basically saying we're going to add a line and a circle just like this one down here too. That one's a much better answer than B, okay? Which is why C is our answer. That being said, I realize that if you answered B, that you could make an argument for that. Drop the activity named discard errors. Yeah, let's just hold on to all errors and sell those to the customer. That's just a great idea. No, D is not an option, okay? So the answer technically is C. If you answered B, you can make an argument for it, but I don't like the question in general. This is a question I definitely should replace. And I didn't, which shows you where I'm at in my mental thinking right now. All right. Now we're doing Excel stuff. Okay. What is the Excel function that's used to combine separate pieces of information? I don't have to go too much more than that. That's our concatenate function. Assume that you're attempting to create an Excel formula that assigns a letter grade based on percentage points a student earns in the course. That sounds really familiar. It's like we did something like that in one of our activities. In fact, we did. And what did I call that? I called that a nested if statement. That's when we use multiple if statements together concurrently. Assume that I wanted to know the quantity of non-blank cells within a certain range of an Excel spreadsheet. Which one would I use? Okay, so it's going to be between count or count A, but one of those is more distinct than the other. Is it count or count A? What do you guys think? Count A. I have a count A. Does anybody agree? Does anybody disagree? Is anybody really afraid to answer? All right, we got a lot of people afraid to answer. Count A is correct. Why? Count only looks for numeric values. That's not what I specified. I specified anything that is blank. So it has if it had a numeric or any other type of value, count A would pick that up, okay? Count would only pick up something that has a numeric value. In our Excel Pride discussions, I mentioned that newer and more powerful programs have greatly improved visualization and presentation over what Excel is capable of. However, I did provide an example of a tool that more recent programs not only allowed for visualization, but enabled filtering and selection of data for presentation. What was the name of this tool? This was a pivot chart, okay? That was basically taking a pivot table and putting it to a chart. We did a very simple one, and yet it was still pretty cool, okay? It's still one of those things that at this level, we're like, that's pretty basic. You showed that to somebody who's in another program in the program here at Truman State, they say, wow, that's cool. How do you do that? If you show it to somebody outside of Truman State, they're going to think you're a genius, okay? That's just the way it works. Like I said, this is not going to be on the exam, but one thing of life advice, okay? All these tips and tricks I'm telling you about Excel, don't tell anybody about them, okay? If you show people how easy they are, our lives are ruined, okay? Our job as business people, there's no mystique anymore. The transparency, the veil of transparency is gone, or veil of opaqueness, I guess would be what it is. One of the first steps you encountered in setting up NetSuite access was the assignment of your role in information system. I gave you instructions that you had to have this role, and apparently everybody has it because I haven't received any notes. But what was that role that I specified? You have to be the administrator. Does that mean that you will be that the transactions that we're going to be working on are all administrative transactions? No, the reason that we're doing administrator is because we want to be able to do everything within the system. Intuitively speaking, there would be a lot of separation of roles and responsibilities, which sounds a lot like one thing I talked about earlier that I said was really important. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, segregation of duties. Yeah, that would be in NetSuite, is that truly speaking, we should not have all of these roles that we can perform. We would have different people performing each of these tasks. That will be very relevant when we get to the next part of NetSuite after the first exam. All right. In NetSuite, I navigate to transactions and financial based on where I appear to be going. What task am I likely to perform here? Okay, so it's probably a transaction is probably what I'm going to be doing. All right, so which of these best represents a transaction? A journal entry. That's kind of how we characterize transactions in a business environment. So that's entering a journal entry. If I was going to create a new new account in the chart accounts, I'd go to setup. If I was going to go transaction detail report, I'd be going to reports. Then setting up new accounting periods, I'd be going to setup. This is the only one that involves going to transactions that we've looked at so far. All right, moving forward. Jump over this exam. All right, so dear Liz, business stationery supply company located in Kirksville. You've been hired to join the accounting business staff. And based on the narrative, you're going to have to actually create a few items. So once you create a BPMN diagram of DLI's revenue process. All right, sorry. So you do not need a diagram, don't need to diagram any message flows. There's just a single lane item. This is going to look very similar to like the one we saw in the slides. And in fact, it is nearly identical, okay? You may notice that I did make one change. There was no application of graphics in this particular diagram. So if you memorize the one that's in the slides and you said, okay, I'm going to apply graphics, make sure you remove that out if you answer that way on the exam, because we didn't apply graphics in this particular scenario. But other than that, all of our activities were identical. The narrative was identical to what we talked about. And that's kind of the intuition, is that you need to know that. So I will talk about these here in just a second, because the next question says, in the diagram that not you created in part A, identify the point in the revenue process where revenue recognition occurs and prepare the journal entry. So remember, revenue recognition occurs when the goods are shipped to the customer. That's the delivery of order. We have not fulfilled our responsibility until we've delivered the order to the customer. That's why we don't record that transaction. And then I said, you absolutely need to know what the transaction looks like. There's two parts. There's the sales part of the transaction, which is going to be debit accounts receivable, credit sales revenue. And then there's going to be the actual cost of goods sold transaction, debit to cost of goods sold and credit to inventory. All right. Should remember this back from your accounting classes. If you don't, might want to crack out those 220 and 221 textbooks. Okay. And then in the diagram, VU, you can tell I copy and pasted, and I copy and pasted the same problem or same error. VU created in part A, identify the point in the revenue process where the cash receipt would occur, and for the journal entry, record the cash receipt. So you can answer this, by the way, a couple different ways. You can actually tell me right here in this diagram, or you can just actually draw your image and then put it right here in the image. This is where we record the sales, or record the cash receipts. Now, I realize you may say, Dr. Barnes, that's not fair. In the BPMN diagram you gave us in the slides, we didn't actually have a element in that BPMN diagram that showed the reporting of the cash receipts. The good thing is I'm showing you now, and I'm helping you for room for interpretation for the future. Even though I didn't necessarily diagram it, you are still responsible for knowing where the transaction recognition points occur. So, cash and accounts receivable, we collect our cash, we remove our accounts receivable. That's all there is to it. All right. Another staff member at DLI's accounting and business department prepared a UML diagram for sales quotes. The partial diagram is shown below. So here's a couple of interesting situations. You got to actually interpret what the association between quotes and employees and prepare interpretation of the association. Now, this is one of those examples that I was talking about. There are two question marks here. I am open-ended as to interpretation if I ask you something like this on the exam, but your interpretation has to be sensible, all right? The way that I would assume that this would go, particularly since this is diagrammed based on what we already looked at, is that we got 0 to many and 1 to 1. So 0 to many right here, 1 to 1 right here. So each quote is provided by one employee and only one employee, which makes perfect sense. Okay, we usually don't have multiple employees associated with quotes. And employees can be involved in 0 quotes, or they can be involved in many quotes, because you have some that are not involved in this process or this point in the process who don't do quotes at all. You can have some that's their entire job, and so they do multiple a day. All right, so that's how we would interpret that. Again, if your interpretation was different, I am not looking for 100% accuracy on this. I'm looking for reasoned interpretation, but it does have to be reasonable. Okay, if I say this is 1 to 1 is the correct answer right here, and you say 0 to many, it's unlikely that I will consider that to be correct, because those are very, very different answers. All right. Based on the narrative being the problem, identify the additional resource events and agents should be included in the complete UML class diagram of the revenue process. So let's just go ahead and think about this, okay? So our full UML class diagram, it contains 6 elements, if I remember correctly. Yes, 6 elements. So we're talking about, I thought for some reason I was keep including more, but we talked about, actually we can include 7 elements. My apologies, 7 elements. So quotes was our first step, and then we added something down here, and then we added something down here. Let's just go ahead and go through the REA before we actually talk about the full diagram, okay? So we have identified products as a resource in the revenue process, which makes sense, okay? We're selling that inventory. What is another resource that we would have in the revenues process? One that we hope to generate as in a result of the transactions. Cash, okay? So we have cash, okay? That being said, that it gives us a lot of information about the events, okay? So events are going to be quotes, okay? If a quote is completed, if a quote is accepted, then that's going to be followed up by what from the customer? An order. Yeah, an order. A customer is going to send an order, and then they're going to receive their order, presumably, and then they're going to send us cash. What do we call that event? Cash receipts. Yes, okay. And then our agents, do we need to actually add any more agents here? No, these agents are included. Now, argument is, could we include multiple more areas? Like, for example, we have an order. Could we also have an order delivery? Could that be an event? The answer is yes, okay? This is not a holistic interpretation of the full diagram. Could I include an order delivery as an additional event here? That's certainly possible. Why do I not do that? Because the difference between the order and the order delivery is not all that distinct. And the more classes that you include in a diagram, the more associations you are required for depiction. This is 7, and it's actually pretty complex. I don't really like going beyond 7 because then I have to depict multiple associations again. So again, this is entirely optional to you. As long as what you provide is reasonable, that's all I'm asking for. So down here, say resources are cash, events, orders, and cash receipts, agents, none. Now, the next step, I do want to clarify something, okay? because I do a lot of this in my exams, is that I actually ask one question and I ask you to use information from that question for your depiction in the following question. If you answered this question incorrectly, if you said something like, okay, cash and then inventory, like you included inventory twice, all right? As long as you include that in your UML diagram, I will not count the next question wrong, okay? Even if it's not part of the consolidated UML diagram I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is consistency between this answer and your next question. So if there are linked questions like this one, I'm looking to make sure that your answers are consistent, even if they're not necessarily correct. Does everybody understand what I mean by that? Okay. If you included something in here or didn't include something in here, as long as you're consistent with your inclusion in this diagram, that's all I care about, okay? So the next diagram is say, make sure you interpret it. You did not need to include multiplicities. All you need to include is the classes and the associations, all right? This is the most complex type of question. There's a question that's another complex question on the actual exam that involves the UML diagram. This is probably the highest level of complexity you get. I will say that when the UML diagram is formatted and structured a little bit differently, but still it retains this level of complexity, okay? So please be very clear when you're actually preparing these that you go back and review the ones that we talked about. This is just a replication from the slides. That's all there is to it. If you forget it, there's still some outs. You can say, all right, I know the revenue process. I remember the REAs. All I have to do is to try to make sure I understand the intuitive associations. So it's not a required memorization, but I would strongly encourage you, if you're really, really uncomfortable with it, go and memorize those UML diagrams, because that's going to be the easiest way to replicate something like this. Okay. With that, that's the practice exam. Are there any questions on the practice exam or anything I didn't cover in the study guide or practice exam? Yes, Jack.
For BPMN diagram, I used a gateway for if ordered products were not in our inventory, then going to like a separate order more inventory and closing that gateway. Is that an appropriate interpretation?
That is absolutely fine. It's not a required inclusion in the diagram because I'm actually asking for simple BPMN diagrams, but I would not count that wrong if you included it. Any other questions? All right, best of luck with studying this weekend. I'll see you all on Monday in VH 1428.